Remember our levels of psychological functioning that we discussed earlier in Module 1. Now, in this module, we will be focusing on the first biological level. That is, we'll be talking all about your brain and nervous system. A word of caution before we get started. We're going to be covering a lot of technical terms in this video, some of which may be new to you. Feel free to pause this video at any point if you need to slow down as we cover these different terms. You'll need to know the functions of different brain structures for the upcoming exam. So just what is going on inside of your brain? This is a very complicated question that scientists are still only beginning to understand. Although we've certainly come a long way in the past few decades, there's still so much more to learn about how our brain works. First, it's a myth that we only use about 10% of our brain. The popular 2011 movie Limitless is based on this idea, but it turns out it's just not true. You use all of your brain, nearly all the time. Your brain is constantly working hard to help keep you alive and to create your seamless conscious experience of reality. In fact, you use more than 10% of your brain even when you're asleep. However, it is true that different parts of the brain do appear to have somewhat specialized functions, and as a result, they may be more or less active at any given moment. Let's explore some of these different brain structures and their associated functions now together. First, if you look at a brain, one of the first things you'll probably notice is that it's kind of divided into two halves, which we refer to as the left and right hemispheres. These two hemispheres do have somewhat specialized functions. For example, the left hemisphere is heavily involved in language processing and has also been shown to be superior for forming associations in memory, selective attention, and positive emotions. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, has been shown to be superior in pitch perception and negative emotions. However, the idea of left and right-brained kinds of people is a huge oversimplification of this idea. So for example, if you are a more analytical type of person, it definitely does not mean that you rely on your left hemisphere more than your right. Rather, both hemispheres are always working together in complex ways. Each hemisphere is also responsible for controlling the sensory input and motor output of one half of your body. Interestingly, each hemisphere controls the opposite side. That is, your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. This is a principle known as contralateralization. An example of this can sometimes be found with individuals who have suffered from a stroke. The person may continue to have trouble with muscle control on one side of their body. For example, perhaps they have difficulty controlling their right arm or the right side of their mouth. In this case, it means that the damage during their stroke primarily occurred on the left side of their brain. The two hemispheres are not completely separated, but are connected by a bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum, which you can see here highlighted in blue from both the dorsal or top and sagittal or side perspectives. Normally, the two hemispheres communicate freely and seamlessly via the corpus callosum. However, some individuals have undergone a procedure to sever their corpus callosum. This is usually done in an attempt to control severe seizures that have not been responsive to other treatments. The resulting phenomena is sometimes referred to as split brain. Essentially, these individuals have two brains, their left hemisphere and their right hemisphere, that are acting semi-independently from each other. There has been some fascinating research on split brain individuals, and you can check out some of this research in the supplemental video on Canvas. Looking at a brain, the next thing you might notice is that it is covered in bumps and ridges. The bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. This entire outer layer of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it is involved in many of our higher level thinking processes, such as conscious thought and language processing. The gyri and sulci on the cerebral cortex also form important landmarks that allow us to easily identify different brain regions. First, the longitudinal fissure, which runs down the middle of the brain, separates the left and right hemispheres, which we just discussed. Other gyri and sulci further divide the cerebral cortex into 4 different major regions, which we call lobes. The aptly named frontal lobe, which sits at the front of the brain, is involved in judgment and decision-making. The rear of the frontal lobe also houses the motor cortex, which you can see here in the dark orange. The motor cortex is responsible for sending messages to our motor muscles to produce body movement. The temporal lobe, shown here in green, is involved in memory and auditory processing. A specific area of the temporal lobe, called Wernicke's area, is responsible for language comprehension. The parietal lobe houses the somatosensory cortex, which you can see here in the dark blue. The somatosensory cortex receives sensory information from the rest of the body. And the occipital lobe, at the very back of the brain and shown here in yellow, is your brain's visual processing center. If you were to peek beneath the surface of this outer cortex, you would see that inside your brain you also have several specialized structures. First, the thalamus is your brain's primary relay station for incoming sensory information. Incoming information from all of your senses, except for smell, stops first at your thalamus before being relayed to the other regions of the brain for further processing. The hypothalamus is involved in reward processing. Its name comes from the fact that it sits below the thalamus, and hypo is an ancient Greek root meaning under or below. The hippocampus helps convert information from short-term into long-term memory. People with damage to their hippocampus are no longer able to form new long-term memories. We already learned about one such individual earlier in module 2.3 with Henry Molaison. Finally, the amygdala, traditionally thought of as the brain's fear center, is now recognized to be involved in processing emotions more generally, not just fear. Collectively, these structures are sometimes referred to as the limbic system. You may have also heard this part of the brain referred to before as your mammalian brain, but that is yet another brain-related myth. This idea came from an evolutionary hypothesis in the 1960s, but today this idea has been largely discredited. There are also a few important structures at the base of the brain. At the very back of the brain is the cerebellum, which is Latin for little brain, because, well, that's kind of what it looks like. The cerebellum is involved in balance and coordinating muscle movements. There's also some evidence that damage to your cerebellum can interfere with judging the size of or distance from objects and with your sense of timing or rhythm. Lastly, there is the brainstem, which connects the brain to the spinal cord. And within the brainstem, there are some specialized structures that play an important role in basic life support functions. Specifically, the medulla is very important as it helps to control your breathing and your heart rate. The pons plays a role in regulating your sleep-wake cycle, and it also connects to the cerebellum to help control your balance. Inside the brainstem is a collection of neurons known as the reticular formation, or sometimes more broadly referred to as the reticular activating system. Together with the thalamus, the reticular formation is also involved in controlling wakefulness, alertness, and attention. Let's pause for a quick application practice question. Which of the following brain structures could you not physically live without? The answer is A, medulla. Remember, the medulla is part of the brainstem and helps to regulate breathing and heart rate, so it is very important for our survival. You might be wondering how we know what each of these different parts of the brain do. Historically, the main way that people learned about specialized brain functions was through the study of brain injury patients, such as Henry Molaison. Another famous brain injury patient is Phineas Gage. Phineas was a railroad worker during the 1800s. While at work, he suffered a horrible accident where a large rod was actually driven through his head in an explosion, as you can see here in the picture. Remarkably, Phineas survived the accident. However, many people reported that afterwards, Phineas underwent some changes in his personality. There's been some evidence that reports of these changes may have been a bit exaggerated. However, it does seem that Phineas, who was reportedly a pretty conscientious person prior to his accident, afterwards became a little bit more prone to certain risky behaviors, such as gambling. Importantly, we think that the part of the brain that Phineas injured was his frontal lobe. Remember, this part of the brain is involved in decision-making and planning, so it makes sense that if this part of Phineas's brain was injured, that he would have difficulty making good decisions that appropriately weighed risk and reward. While studying individuals with brain injuries can be illuminating, these individuals are, thankfully, fairly rare, which makes them difficult for scientists to study systematically. Moreover, they may differ in other important ways from otherwise healthy individuals, which means that findings from these studies may not always be generalizable. Another way to study the brain is to examine it post-mortem, or after death. This allows us to closely examine different physical parts of the brain, and data from these studies can be helpful in certain cases. For example, Dr. Benay Omalu discovered the brain disease CTE by examining thin slices of brain tissue from a deceased football player. However, post-mortem studies don't allow us to actually study the brain in action, so to speak, and that's often precisely what we want to know. What is going on inside of our brains as we are actively thinking and feeling and doing? In recent decades, technologies have been invented that allow us to do precisely that, to look at brain functioning in living, healthy individuals. One of the most common ways to do this right now is through an fMRI, which stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. An fMRI tracks the flow of oxygenated blood to different regions of the brain. Since we know that cells demand more oxygen when they are working harder, the logical assumption is that areas of the brain with more blood flow are more active in that moment. So, for example, if we have someone complete a task in an fMRI scanner, such as viewing pictures of familiar and unfamiliar people, we can see which parts of the brain are more active during that task. And presumably, those are the same brain regions that are going to be involved in whatever that task demands, such as facial recognition. However, it's important to note a couple important limitations of fMRI studies. First, fMRI studies can be very difficult and expensive to conduct. For this reason, most fMRI studies have very small sample sizes. This limits generalizability and can also greatly increase the chance of getting a false positive result. So the findings from a single fMRI study should always be taken with a grain of salt until they can be replicated by future research. Additionally, we need to remember that even seemingly simple tasks can be broken down into many different subtasks that recruit several different regions of the brain. For example, when viewing familiar and unfamiliar faces, we need to keep in mind that the brain is engaging in many other kinds of tasks too, such as basic visual perception and reading facial expressions. So it can sometimes be difficult to isolate any one particular function that we might be interested in. For this reason, interpreting the findings from fMRI studies can sometimes be challenging. Just because a part of the brain lights up, so to speak, what does that actually mean? Indeed, as I already mentioned, the amygdala was originally thought to be the fear center of the brain, but we now know that its role is more complex than that. Similarly, our understanding of many other brain regions is continuing to evolve as we conduct more studies and collect new data. Finally, it's important to note that even though different brain regions are specialized for different functions, your brain can also change and adapt in some remarkable ways. We call the brain's capacity for change neuroplasticity. For example, you might wonder what happens in the occipital lobe of an individual who is born blind. With no visual input to process, does the occipital lobe simply stop working? Not at all. Rather, the neural connections in the occipital lobe simply adapt to take on other functions. Your brain can also adapt to changes in your environment after birth. In fact, every time you learn something new, the neural structure of your brain has changed, if ever so slightly. For example, people's brains change in many ways after learning a new skill, such as learning to play a musical instrument or speak a new language. This process of learning is highly beneficial and has many protective benefits for our brain. One study even found that people who are bilingual developed dementia on average 4 years later than individuals who were monolingual. This is all encouraging news because it means that you can actually change and rewire your brain based on the behaviors you engage in every single day. For more information on brain plasticity, you can check out the supplemental videos on Canvas. In this video, we looked at different brain regions and structures and their associated functions. For the exam, you should be able to identify each of the different brain regions and structures that we discussed and describe their associated functions, describe different methods that are used to study the brain, such as brain injury, postmortem, and fMRI, and discuss their associated benefits and drawbacks, define contralateralization and apply this concept to an example, and define neuroplasticity.